Coming up, the bottom line is there are only two candidates among the entire Democrat slate that remains at this point who have a substantial number of their supporters committed either only to them or who are significantly inclined not to vote for an alternative candidate from their party if their candidate doesn't win. There are only two Democrat candidates who have charisma. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's talk about a poll that's getting a lot of publicity for one of the things it reveals. But the other thing it reveals is being ignored. How many of you have heard about the Emerson poll, which reveals that 42% of Andrew Yang supporters won't vote for the Democrat nominee if it isn't Andrew Yang? And 31% of Bernie Sanders supporters responded to the same question by saying it depends. And that's in addition to 16% who say they won't vote for the nominee if it's not Bernie Sanders. And 9% of Yang supporters say it depends as well. So what did the media say about this poll? Well, it commented on the fact that nearly half of Andrew Yang supporters wouldn't vote for the Democratic nominee if it wasn't Andrew Yang. I understand that. That's clearly one of the key points the poll reveals. Some coverage also focused on the fact that many of Bernie Sanders supporters said that either they wouldn't support the Democratic nominee if it wasn't Bernie, or it depends on other factors. And that, of course, was one of the key points the poll reveals. It's largely the same as the point regarding Yang supporters, but there is a difference. What exactly was intended by the Bernie supporters when they talked about whether they would support the Democratic nominee, depending on other factors? I think it's pretty obvious what those other factors are. I think there are two determining factors in whether Bernie Sanders supporters who answer the question with "it depends" will vote for the Democratic nominee. I think there are two things which would cause those Bernie supporters not to vote for the Democrat nominee. The first is if they feel like Bernie was shafted by the party. That's understandable, especially in light of the way the Democratic Party rigged the campaign process in 2016 to shaft Bernie. I think the second determining factor is if Michael Bloomberg gets the nomination. I don't see any way that those Bernie supporters are going to vote for a billionaire with so much money that he makes Donald Trump look like a pauper, and who is essentially buying the nomination with so much advertising spend that it's overwhelming the budgets of all the other candidates combined. And I suppose, considering the possibility of a brokered convention, we should also take into account the incredible possibility that Hillary Clinton, of all people, could get the nomination, and that would, of course, cause a huge loss of support in the general election from Bernie Sanders supporters. None of those angles was sufficiently explored by the bulk of the media. It truly is sad the extent to which the media isn't doing its job, unless, of course, you consider its job to be the propaganda arm of the Democrat Party. But there's something else that was missed in the coverage of that poll. You hear a lot of talk from the left about Trump supporters being part of a cult. You hear a lot about the support being based on the person rather than the policy. But the bottom line is that President Trump has made a personal connection with huge numbers of voters. They trust him. They believe he has their interests in mind. And you don't normally see that with politicians. And the ones you do see it with tend to be quite successful if they have the right combination of additional factors. In my lifetime, the most charismatic president was undoubtedly Ronald Reagan. As I've said before, it's too early to tell where Donald Trump will stand historically among U.S. presidents, but there is a possibility that he could rival Ronald Reagan with his successes. Only time will tell. So why do I bring up presidential charisma? Because that's a part of the reason why supporters of a candidate for a party nomination wouldn't support the eventual party nominee if it's not the one they support in the primaries. Some have it and some don't. Does anybody think Al Gore or Mitt Romney have charisma? Any charisma? I certainly don't. So don't think I'm just being critical of this year's Democratic Party slate, or I'm being critical only of Democrats. The bottom line is there are only two candidates among the entire Democrat slate that remains at this point who have a substantial number of their supporters committed either only to them or who are significantly inclined not to vote for an alternative candidate from their party if their candidate doesn't win. There are only two Democrat candidates who have charisma, and those two candidates are Andrew Yang and Bernie Sanders. Now, as you know, I vehemently oppose both of those candidates, and for that matter, as you know, I'm a strong supporter of Donald Trump. The reason why I vehemently oppose Andrew Yang is because, among other things, the universal basic income, which is the centerpiece of his candidacy, is a disaster in the making, which would threaten our market capitalist economy and thereby threaten our prosperity. Bernie Sanders as president would be an even more unmitigated disaster. The idea that anyone would propose replacing the most successful economy in history with socialism is beyond insanity. I covered the problems with UBI and Bernie's communist tendencies in prior episodes. So it's clear that I oppose both of those candidates, but I noted that they do exhibit some charisma, at least based on the loyalties of their supporters. As I noted, charismatic politicians can be very successful with the right combination of other factors. Well, do Yang and Sanders have the right combination of other factors? I don't think so. In the case of Yang, the combination of lack of experience, lack of support from the Democratic Party, and what is, for all practical purposes, a single-issue campaign will prevent him from winning the nomination. In the case of Bernie Sanders, he might very well win the nomination, although I don't think anyone doubts the Democrat Party will do what it can to prevent it. And doing what it can includes getting support from much of the media, which has become essentially an arm of the party. Of course, the odds of Sanders winning the nomination will be highest if the field doesn't shrink soon. So what about the general election? Could Sanders win it? Of course he could, and that's all the more reason that every Republican, every Trump supporter, everyone who wants to make sure that the United States continues to grow and continues to offer its citizens an enormous, vibrant economy, which offers everyone a chance for prosperity, must vote to ensure that Donald Trump is reelected. But the message of the Emerson poll that hasn't really been covered isn't just that there's evidence among their supporters that Andrew Yang and Bernie Sanders are charismatic. The other part of the message is that the remainder of the Democratic candidates are not charismatic. And incidentally, who does the poll show is the least charismatic? Which candidate has the fewest supporters who will refuse or may refuse to vote for the Democrat Party nominee if it's not their candidate? Well, that is Elizabeth Warren. Do you know what percentage of her supporters in that poll said they definitely wouldn't vote for the Democrat nominee if it wasn't her? 0%. That's right. In the poll sample, not a single one of her supporters would definitely refuse to vote for the Democratic Party nominee if it wasn't Elizabeth Warren. You know, I'm often critical of political analysts. As I've said before, it was analysts more than pollsters who blew the predictions in 2016. But as to Elizabeth Warren, they seem to have gotten it right. I've heard multiple analysts say that Elizabeth Warren doesn't have a connection with voters. They may support her. They may support her policies, but the personal connection just isn't there. If you're looking for charisma and you're looking at Elizabeth Warren, you're looking in the wrong place. Next topic. The secret Iowa collapse. If you're like me, you watched with shock and even a little bit of amusement when the Democrat Iowa caucus was so poorly handled that we still can't be sure of the final vote count. The catastrophic failure of the app that was supposed to streamline the running of the caucus turned into a disaster, with local offices trying to phone in the caucus results, with one local official actually being hung up on by party headquarters after waiting for an hour on hold, with the hang-up occurring live on CNN. All things considered, I'm not sure I could imagine a worse result for the Democrat Party. With a lineup that consists primarily of candidates who want to take over America's healthcare system, the party came off looking like it's incapable of planning a 10-year-old's birthday party, let alone a statewide caucus or the administration of healthcare in a country of 330 million people. Prove to me that you can order a cake, fill up some balloons, hang a piñata, and book somebody dressed as SpongeBob, then run a party caucus efficiently and effectively and with accurate results. Then talk to me about your plans to take over the healthcare system. And I haven't even touched upon the bizarre connection between the Buttigieg campaign and the old Hillary Clinton campaign to the company that produced the app which failed. If you're big into conspiracy theories, the Iowa caucus had the potential to be your Roswell. But for all that craziness, the biggest problem for the Democrat Party with the Iowa caucus was one which was barely talked about by the media. And that's saying a lot because there was an awful lot of discussion of the Iowa caucus this past week. So what was the problem? Party bigwigs were expecting a strong turnout for the caucus, and they didn't get it. They were expecting something close to the 238,000 turnout they had in 2008, but they were nowhere near it. Instead, at 176,000, they were only 5,000 voters above the turnout in 2016. And the first-time caucus goers represented only 35% of the total. That compares to 44% in 2016 and a record 57% in 2008. The bottom line is that fewer people than expected turned out for the caucuses, and a lower than expected percentage of those people were turning out for the first time. That demonstrates a lack of enthusiasm overall, and a lack of enthusiasm among those who've traditionally not been politically active. That goes against everything you've been hearing from the media. It goes against the argument that Democrats are mad as hell at President Trump and poised to turn out in huge numbers to the polling places. But what if they aren't? If you're like me, you've heard a lot of people saying that this election will be a referendum on Donald Trump. What if that's true, but the people just aren't that upset at him? What if people are pretty satisfied with the state of the country, and perhaps they're a bit turned off by Donald Trump's over-the-top and sometimes brutish behavior, but that isn't going to cause them to vote against their pocketbooks? I think there's a strong likelihood that's the case. Is there a counter-argument to that point? Certainly. The counter-argument is that Iowa is Iowa, that it's changed, that it's become more conservative, more Republican, more Trumpified, if you will, that it's no longer even close to a bellwether state. As we move on to New Hampshire's primary, we'll get a bit better reading. If the turnout is below expectations in New Hampshire, if it looks more like 2016 instead of 2008, you can expect a lot of Democrat Party bigwigs to be downing Maalox or Pepto-Bismol through a funnel like college kids with Natty Light. Frankly, I can't wait to see the turnout numbers in New Hampshire. Next topic. Best week ever. I'm going to keep this one short because you've heard it all over the news. How good was this past week for President Trump? It was so good that even if you ignore his acquittal in the impeachment trial in the Senate, and you ignore Gallup poll results showing that he has the best personal approval numbers of his presidency, and you ignore his incredible State of the Union speech, perhaps the best speech of his presidency, and you ignore Nancy Pelosi's foolish choice to tear up his speech on national television while seated just a couple of feet behind him after he had introduced a string of patriotic, heroic, heartwarming and tear-inducing Americans and American stories, you still have to deal with Iowa. And the result there was so good for President Trump that House Minority Leader McCarthy is claimed to have said in a Republican leadership meeting that, quote, only Donald Trump could win both the Democrat and Republican Iowa caucuses, close quote. The only thing more I can say is don't get cocky. Not every week will be like this. The Democrats won't stop. The introduction of Bloomberg money into the Democrat races is a real threat. The Democrats keep exploring their flavor of the week. This week, it's Pete Buttigieg. But as I've said before, it's really hard to believe that one of the two major political parties is going to nominate the mayor of a small city of 102,000 people, and he wasn't particularly successful at being the mayor of a small city, to have him campaign to move directly into the White House to lead a nation of over 330 million people with the largest economy in the world and the most powerful military on the planet. I don't believe it's going to happen. And it points out the problem for the Democrats that I've been talking about for months. Their slate of candidates is horrible. And in that overcrowded slate of horrible candidates is a full-on socialist who honeymooned in the Soviet Union and has made a practice for decades of cozying up to and speaking glowingly of communist dictators and their governments. The Democrats have a real problem on their hands. And while I'll say it again, we must not get cocky. With each new week that passes showing that the Democrats continue to be confronted with that very problem means that no matter what they do, every week you can make an argument that it was Trump's best week ever. Next topic. The Oscar Grouch. This episode was recorded before the Oscars telecast, so I'm not going to be able to talk about who won, but I can talk about how reluctant I am to watch the telecast, and I have plenty of reasons as a conservative not to watch it. I'm tired of being lectured to. I'm tired of being demonized. I'm tired of effectively being Frankenstein's monster as the Hollywood woke crowd chases me down with pitchforks and torches. I've said before that the behavior of much of Hollywood borders on insanity from the standpoint of a business plan. Imagine writing out your plan for a new business in which you explain that you intend to insult much of your potential customer base by calling it ignorant, uneducated, classless, racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, deplorable bumpkins not smart enough to make an informed political choice. Now imagine presenting that plan to investors. You'd be laughed out of the room. But that doesn't seem to happen in Hollywood. Why? Well, I'm going to leave that specific question hanging, because next week you'll be hearing the answers, and most of them are not going to be coming from me. Next week I'll have on the podcast our first guest, and he is incredibly informed about the workings and history of Hollywood. He's been a movie critic for more than 20 years, and on top of that he has the characteristic that you can almost never find in movie critics. He's a conservative. That's right, I said it, a conservative movie critic. I know that's a bit like saying a thin hippo, a weak football player, or an honest politician. The adjective just doesn't seem to fit the noun. It shouldn't seem that way, but it does. And it does because we've been exposed decade after decade to a movie industry filled with liberals and leftists, with the associated professions that support it, like movie critics likewise being dominated by liberals and leftists. But the assumption that all movie critics are on the left is wrong, and we'll prove it with a great guest in episode 75 to be released on February 16. I know I had a great time talking with him. The conversation was entertaining and informative, and I think you're going to love it. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you about it. Remember, you can post comments on YouTube or send a message on Twitter. But let's get back to the subject at hand, the Oscars. Do I have any predictions? Well, I'm taking a risk here. My expertise and my background is in politics, governmental affairs to be specific. I've been a fan of movies my entire life, but I can't claim to be an expert. Having said that, since we're on the topic, I'll go ahead and give you my thoughts. Given that some of you will be listening to this episode after the Oscars are over, I'm really taking a risk here. For Best Picture, in my opinion, the one that does deserve it is Ford versus Ferrari. The films that have the best chance of getting it include The Irishman, 1917, Joker, and Parasite. But I predict the film which will receive the Best Picture Oscar is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Do I think it deserves it? No, I don't. I found the vast majority of the film to be terminally boring. But it does benefit from one of my unwritten rules, which is that everyone in Hollywood overrates any film about old-time Hollywood. They're just in love with their own business, and anything which celebrates the history of their business will get more than enough love from the Academy. Best Actor in a Leading Role? Joaquin Phoenix for Joker. I'm certainly not going out on a limb here. As anyone that's listened to my review of Joker knows, I'm not a fan of the film, but I can't deny Joaquin Phoenix's performance was incredible. It's some of the best acting I've ever seen. Best Actress in a Leading Role? Renee Zellweger for Judy. Best Actor in a Supporting Role? Maybe I'm stretching a bit here, but I believe it'll go to Brad Pitt for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Even though I'm not a fan of the film, I made it clear that until the closing act, which saved the film, virtually every interesting part of the movie involved Brad Pitt. For anyone wondering which actor has more charisma, Brad Pitt or Leonardo DiCaprio, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood answers that question definitively. And as to Best Actress in a Supporting Role, I only saw one of the movies, Richard Jewell. Kathy Bates was great in that film, as she almost always is, but I'm going to reserve comment. The in-depth discussion regarding film, its connection to politics, the ways in which the movie industry has changed, and how Hollywood as a business gets away with much of what it does will come next week through an interview and discussion that I know you're going to love. And I'll continue to love bringing Political Spirits to you every week. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And we're on Instagram now as well at Political Spirits. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube also, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.